We are going to be talking about problem set number one today. So in this problem set, we have 5 objects. This video is going to cover object number one, and there will be subsequent videos for the rest of the objects. Now, first thing we want to do is zoom in on what it is that we have to create. So I'm going to go to 200% on this file here. If you have a little bit better eyes, maybe you can get away with 150%, but I'm going to need 200%. So we have 2 pictures here, no specific directions, but do notice that some of these other objects have some explicit information that will be helpful. So we have 2 pictures here. The first picture, it shows the 3-dimensional view as well as quite a bit of information we're going to need to create our sketch. Now, if you look here, we can do this in one sketch, one extrusion. And that's probably the way we want to attack this. So if you look at kind of the dark outline of this shape, that'll give you the idea of how it was created in the first place, and probably the simplest way to recreate it. We have quite a few dimensions here, and if we roll over to the second picture, we can see that we are given several perpendicular constraints, meaning all of these angles are right angles, and we have some dimensions as well as a projection symbol, which is what happens when one of the points is coincident with the origin. So we're going to go ahead and create this drawing here. So I'm going to start a sketch. It really doesn't matter where I start. As you'll get going, you'll see how starting on the different planes can impact what you're doing. I'd like to go ahead and get my origin in about the same place it is on the example. And one thing I want to point out is there are many ways to create this. This is only one way, but if you're a beginner, usually going about it the simplest way is the best answer. So I'm just going to kind of work counterclockwise here and do my best to create the perpendicular constraints as I'm going, which you can kind of see that as I'm moving around, it'll kind of snap to the vertical. And that is what I want. Same thing with the horizontal. I get my snaps. It just makes everything a little bit easier. Now you can notice that these 2 points are on the same horizontal line, so I'm going to let that go ahead and put itself in there. Same thing here. This is all on the same horizontal line. Later on, there can be points where you want to make sure you don't get that snap. But if you're talking all 90 degrees perpendiculars, then it just makes your life easier. So I sketch the shape and I don't worry about the dimensions while I'm sketching. I like to come back afterwards and then add my dimensions in. Now what you can do is you can hit this little button down here on the bottom and it will toggle your constraints off or on, or you can also just drag a big box over everything and it will do essentially the same thing. So now just by sketching, I was able to get all of these perpendicular constraints to apply, and that actually covers pretty much all of them. It even put in the vertical here with the first line just because of where I put those 2 points, and because I used the origin or the center point, it put that projection symbol in, which you can see is the same symbol up top here. So at this point, all I really need to do is put in my dimensions, and I just grab the dimension tool, start clicking on the lines I want to put in there, make sure I'm getting the right numbers, and just put them in. Now, sometimes that will happen depending on how and where you sketched. It can make things look really big or small, and it will change as you put things in. So be aware of that and don't be afraid of it. Sometimes it will change it so much you have to zoom in or out with the mouse to see it again. Now, in cases like this, where it moves something where it's not supposed to be, it's really simple. Just grab the thing that should be on the other side and move it there. Now, I didn't start exactly that way, but usually it's best to start with the largest dimensions first and work your way down. But I kind of showed you what happens when you don't, which is sometimes it makes it go really big or really small. All right, now anytime you want to get out of the dimension tool, you can just hit the escape button. You can also right click and click cancel, but I just prefer the escape button. I feel like it's a little bit easier and faster. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the rest of my dimensions here. This is 1.125. This is 0.438. Now, one thing I do want to point out is when you are dimensioning simple straight lines, you can just click the line and then set a dimension. However, if you're doing something that maybe is a little bit more complex, like say I wanted to dimension these two lines, the distance between these two lines, I'd have to click the two specific lines. So something to be aware of going forward, that clicking the line itself is kind of a shortcut, but it doesn't always give you what you want, especially when you're in more complex situations. But for now, in this object, it will work just fine. Now, all of these dimensions, you can go back and edit at any time. When you have the dimension tool clicked, usually just click once and it'll open up that dialog box. If you deselect the dimension tool, you can double click it and you can get into the same box. It's totally up to you in that regard. All right, let's see. Working clockwise here. What am I missing? Oh, I'm missing the 3.75 right here. Now, if you ever get to a point where there's just so many things here you can't click, you can always click the other two lines that you're dimensioning between and put them in that way. It's probably slightly more accurate and repeatable, but it does take an extra click. Now, everything looks black, so what we want to do is look down on the bottom right and see if it's fully constrained, which it is. Fantastic. You can also confirm that your sketch is fully constrained by looking over at the browser. And if you see that little push pin in the sketch button, that means it's fully constrained. And if you kind of hover over it, it will also confirm that it's fully constrained. And fully constrained sketches are where we want to be at all times possible. So now we're going to do our 3D extrusion. We're going to take our 2D sketch and make it go 3D. Now, if you look here in the example, the extrusion actually goes away from us, not towards us, away from us. So I can choose my two directions here to get it to do that and replicate that exactly. Would it be wrong if I did this? No, it wouldn't be wrong. But the example shows it that way, and it's always good to replicate the example as close as possible. I firmly believe that, especially while you're learning. As you're going and learning and you become a little bit more of an intermediate user, please do find different ways to do things. That is always good to expand your skills, but the simpler, the better when you're starting out. All right, if we look at the depth here, I have this arrow right here that kind of shows that third dimension, right? So all of these numbers, dimensions are on the first sketch, and this is the one that's not on the first sketch, because if you look at where those arrows and lines point, that's kind of our third dimension. So we want to go 1 inch, which just also happens to be the default of this program. So at this point, I can kind of take a look left and right. It looks good. Now, you might want to say, or your inclination might be, I want to show these dimensions like you have in the example. Well, in real life, we don't want to show the dimensions. We want to make sure that the dimensions are grayed out or invisible. While I'm working, if I need to see them, I can just right click on the sketch and toggle visibility. Sometimes that's useful, but before you turn this in, always clean up your work as much as possible. Hide any temporary features, turn the sketches off, make sure you're in perfect isometric view. So if you go to isometric view or your home button and it does not look like this, say it looks something like this, that is totally normal and it's very easy to fix. The way I recommend is get as close to the view you're trying to replicate. So if I were trying to replicate this view on the left, this is actually pretty close. So once you get close, click the button to make it perfectly isometric, and then you can click this button, the context menu. It looks like a little eject button, I think. And then you select this option, set current view as home, fit to view. Now, no matter where I go in this CAD universe, by the home button will always bring me back to my new home view. This is how you want to save it, because you want whoever's checking your work, or in the real world, your boss or client, to see a nice, perfect, pretty view that you're being paid to do. So make sure that you save your work. And I do recommend saving it a few more times in the process. So if it does collapse and die, hopefully you don't lose everything you've done. You're going to need to save it here as some kind of naming convention. What I always recommend is to save it in a folder based on that project, so you have everything organized. Because the worst thing you can do, and trust me, I know this from experience, is to end up making 50 of these files, whether it's for a class or your own projects or your job. And you have a bunch of part 1s and 2s and part 1.1, and they're all in one file, and you can't make heads or tails or find what you need to find when you need to find it. So please always create new folders in your save menu and save them accordingly. Be organized. It'll save you time and money down the road. And this is object number 1.